Right, thank you very much. It's going to be a little bit less organised than everyone else, and you'll see that I don't really have any slides. Partly because I thought, with my role being to somewhat tie this all up and tie it all together, it was important that I heard what was said in previous sessions and what people were talking about before I put my speech together. And honestly, I really thought that after 2 or 3 other sessions, it would all have come together in my head and it would just be a breeze and it would be amazing. But actually, it's been a lot harder because there's been so many different opinions and ideas and challenges and views that actually it's not a cohesive picture at all, and there's not a clear direction. So we've talked a lot in the course of these 2 days about the things that crofting can provide and where we can go in the future, and we've talked about carbon and peatland restoration, we've talked about woodlands, we've talked about woodland crofts, not enough I'm sure, Jamie. We've talked about rewilding or improved habitats, let's say. We've talked about housing, we've talked about renewables, we've talked about communities, and I'm very happy to hear that we haven't talked too much about tourism services, but obviously that's an aspect of it as well. The one thing we haven't really talked about is agriculture. And I would argue that agriculture is a fundamental part of crofting. It has been through history. Do we want it to be in the future? I guess what we could say is do we want agriculture to be part of in the future? What would crofting look like if we did just focus on all these other things without agriculture being a key part of it? I'm going to leave that for now, and I'm going to talk a bit about why I think the agricultural side is important. So currently, with agriculture, we do actually feed in a significant portion of inputs into the wider Scottish agricultural system. So actually, without crofting, while each crofter may be small, the communal impact is huge. And if crofting stopped, or if crofting agriculture stopped, the wider Scottish agricultural system would suffer dramatically. It's not only the feed in, but it's also the feed out. I know all of my neighbours and I buy feed in from the East Coast. So crofters are buying produce quite often from other farmers, and without that income, again, those farmers would struggle. We also just feed in an element of supporting services. Our agricultural suppliers may not survive in our area if we didn't have all of the small-scale crofters just buying the few things that they buy every year. So the wider Scottish agricultural system actually depends on the collective impact of lots of small crofters, maybe more than they realise. The other reason that I think the agricultural part of crofting is important and should remain and possibly become even more important in the future is because of local food. So one of the things I do is talk about local food a lot. And there's quite a few reasons why I think it's important. And I understand that it's difficult growing useful, edible food in crofting areas. The more I do, the more I realise why other people don't do it. It's really hard. But the fact is that it's so important, and there's a lot of potential in it. It provides opportunity for employment if we can create local businesses out of food instead of just growing some sheep and cows and shipping them off. It provides a resilience. At the moment, you look at the prices of livestock through the mart, and we're entirely dependent on that external system for the income on those animals. If we have local supply chains, it's much more resilient for the producers to have somewhere to sell their produce. It's also better resilience for communities. We started to see in COVID supply chains breaking down. We're starting to see stuff at the moment with egg shortages, which are mostly due to supermarkets not paying commercial egg producers enough. We're starting to see breakdowns in the supply chain, and the more local food we have, the more likely we are to suffer less when there's either temporary or permanent breakdowns in those food chains. I said employment. It's also a quality issue. A lot of the food that people in my community, and I assume in a lot of your communities too, it's coming from a small shop or possibly a supermarket. It's been on a truck for weeks or sitting in shelves and cold storage. A lot of the vegetables are pretty rubbish, honestly. The meat is we don't know where from. It's from some mass-produced stuff from somewhere. If you're lucky enough to have a local butcher, a local grocer, a veg box scheme, it's amazing. But of a lot of our communities, people don't have access to that. So if we can be producing more of our food, and particularly fresh fruit and vegetables, in our communities, it's actually a really good thing for the health and the well-being, and also just the quality. That, you know, why can't crofters or why can't communities in remote places have access to good food? Why are we eating what's left at the end of the supermarket supply chain? So I think agriculture really does need to remain an important part of crofting, and you know, but a more diversified form. Just also too, where we're going with environmental priorities. Why should we be producing food? There's so much pressure on agriculture at the moment. Anywhere that can produce food well, and by well I mean while preserving biodiversity, not emitting loads of carbon, anywhere that can do that should be doing it. Because if we're not doing it, there's more pressure on other areas to intensify it. So anything we can put into the system takes the pressure off other areas having to produce more or having to produce badly. It's things like, even if we are just focused on habitats, if we're conservation grazing, which we have to do anyway, why shouldn't we be working on taking food off that as well? Even if it's just managing the deer, why shouldn't we be taking food off that as well? So, local food. So the other part of the agricultural side, and what I was originally tasked to talk about, was a bit about regenerative agriculture and agroecology and things like that. It's a lot of the buzzwords at the moment, and they're trying to, you know, really push farming into using these things. And to be honest, don't know that much about it. I don't feel like I do that many things, but what I do is I'm conscious of the effects on the environment of how I farm, how I croft, and I try to make sure that what I'm doing leaves the land in a better place, improves the habitat for nature, and also improve my productivity while I'm doing that. So I think they're buzzwords, they really are, but in its element, what it's doing is considering the nature in the farming you're doing. Now, quite a lot of crofting is already good agroecological practice. We don't tend to use much fertilizer, we don't tend to use pesticides much. We don't tend to plough. I mean, these are three of the big bad things in conventional farming. We quite often have a lot of nature. We have diverse swards with wildflowers and things like that. We have, you know, scrappy verges and stuff where there's loads of wildlife in it. These things are all part of what they're trying to get conventional farming to do, and we already do it. But at the same time, we are quite often guilty of overstating the benefits that crofting already provides. Crofting's amazing for wildlife, it's brilliant, it's wonderful, we all do amazing things. We have extensive agriculture, extensive livestock, and that's good. Actually, not all of our practices are, you know, probably not many of our practices are best practices. Some of them are downright terrible, but mostly we're on a fairly good range there. But there are things that we can improve. Right, so why should we improve? Why should we try to change what we're doing to improve our nature-friendly farming? Partly because we care. I think all of us care about the landscape and the land that we farm in. It should also improve our productivity if we do it well. You quite often think, well, you know, that's just makes my life harder, or I'll get less productivity off the land. But actually, over time, usually the benefits in the habitat and the soil will give you better productivity. Things like trees, give them 20 years, you have shelter, you have more grass, generally all round better for your livestock as well as for your habitat. The other reason we might want to do it is because that's what the government is paying for, or that's what the government will be paying for in the future. So as a supplemental form of income. It's quite difficult with a lot of these things. How do we measure what we're providing? We already do a lot of good things, but how do we measure that? And that's one of my questions that I'll come on to later, because if subsidies are going to become more conditional, you're going to need to prove that you're doing what they want. And you can't just say, oh, but I farm well, look, I've got butterflies. Well, you could, but you're probably going to need to do a bit more than that. And if you're going to make changes, you need to be able to show that you've made those changes. One of the things that came up in the carbon discussion yesterday was that actually a lot of crofters and probably a lot of farmers don't really understand what net zero means, and particularly not what it means to them, and particularly not how what they're doing might affect net carbon. And it's the same with biodiversity. you know, a lot of crofters do have a good feel for the quality of their land and the condition that it's in, but they may not understand the detail that policymakers are looking for. They may not understand some of the target species. They may only understand the state that their land is in at the moment and not the state that it could be in or that it used to be in. It's really important that we get this information out there, that we engage with crofters and help them to understand what policymakers are asking for, what the public is looking for, and also then work with them to what they can deliver. There's no point saying, you need to deliver this. Crofters aren't going to, you know, you guys all know crofters. If you tell them that they need to do this, they're not going to take that very well. But it is their land and they do understand it. And if they can then understand how what they're doing impacts these national policy goals and what they might be paid for, then they can probably come up with ways that they can continue their crofting while delivering these targets. So crofters really do need to drive this movement to net zero, to biodiversity, and to this new sort of systems that we want to deliver food, net zero, biodiversity, and communities as well. And it's very complicated, and as I said, coming here, there's so many different directions and opinions and thoughts about what we should do and what we should protect and what we shouldn't. And I always come back to, and even before here, I come back to the idea of why crofting? Why are we trying to protect crofting? What is this system and why is it important? A lot of the goals and a lot of the things that we've talked about in these 2 days, you can do without crofting. You can do rewilding or nature improvement and peatland restoration without crofting. Arguably, it might be easier. You can have resilient rural communities. You can provide other employment. You can have other industries without crofting. You can do that. You can have community land ownership, so you can get the rights over the land. You can have that sense of community. You can have those support structures, the co-housing, the intergenerational relationships. You can have all of that without crofting. So why do we want crofting? Why are we standing here trying to find a future for crofting? Do we just want a system of communities and land ownership and management that's independent from crofting? And me personally, I think crofting is really important, and I'm sure that most of you in this room probably do, but I think some of you are probably going, well, you know, yeah, like why are we wedded to this system when we can get all this in potentially better ways? Let's face it, common grazings committees are quite often dysfunctional. They're not the best way to provide some of these outcomes at the moment. They have the potential to be, but they are one of the weakest links in the system of crofting being able to deliver these things. So why do we want crofting? I think I'm going to start with one that is just completely standalone from everything else. And I believe that culturally it's important. I believe that historically and culturally it's different to just a system of land holding. It's not just a set of laws and a way that the land is organised. I think there is more to that. And I don't think it's the place from people, policymakers looking in from outside to say that people who this system belongs to shouldn't be able to have it anymore. So that, I think, again, to most people in this room, that will be so ingrained in you that you won't even question it. But there are people who don't see that, who don't understand that crofting as a cultural thing is important enough to keep. One of the things that came up, and I think almost all the talks, and it was part of the quote from the Shook-Smith report, was that crofting provides a connection to the land and a sense of place. And that is one thing that I think if you went to other systems you would potentially lose. And that is absolutely vital for a lot of the things about drawing people into rural communities, keeping them there, keeping them strong, having communities want to work together. So I think that sense of place and ownership and stake, and by ownership I don't mean legal ownership, I mean a personal sense of ownership of that land. I think crofting it delivers that, and I think that is one thing that you will find very hard to maintain without crofting. But the sheer cultural and historical importance of it, I think, makes it worth preserving. But for the more practical and less sentimental people amongst us, it also works as a keystone. Crofting in itself does not deliver anything that something else can't deliver. There's my notes. But it provides support that makes all these things easier to deliver through other systems. So you don't need crofting to have economically sustainable rural communities, but crofting is really useful at providing a supplemental income for people. You don't need crofting to attract people to rural communities, but it does provide a lifestyle that attracts a lot of people to stay or return to these areas. You don't need crofting for communities to have land rights and empowerment, but at the moment, until land reform and community ownership is sorted out, crofting is the only thing that provides rights to land in a lot of crofting areas. It acts as an activity, as I said, that supports other businesses, agricultural supply businesses. If you start getting more local food, you start having local butchers. You don't need that. You could get business and economics from other causes, but crofting is a piece of that puzzle that then takes the pressure off everything else. And you don't need it for food, but it can provide that food, and as I said, it can probably provide better quality, more reliable, resilient food systems than just relying on everything else. It also provides a common purpose. Again, you don't need this. Community organisations can have a common purpose, but crofting helps. And because our systems are so fragile, everything that you can have that contributes helps. And as I said, it gives people that stake in the land and a connection to it and a sense of ownership. So you can't say crofting's essential, because you can have all this stuff without crofting. But the fact that this one system provides all of these supportive elements to all the other systems that you're working with is just so important in itself. So I think the cumulative effect of all this is enough to make crofting worth supporting the system as it is now. Right, back to my main notes. So a little bit on agricultural subsidies, because we do tend to rely on them for the income that crofting provides. Now, moving forward, they're talking about a lot more conditionality in our payments. They won't pay us for producing food, generally, because they want public money for public goods. And food is not a public good, because it can be traded privately, you can stop other people from having it, and you can get your own income from it. So the way they're going, they will never just pay us for producing food. And they probably aren't just going to pay us for holding land, which is what they basically do at the moment. So we start to look at what are the public goods that we could be paid for. I guess before that point, do we need subsidies for crofting? Could crofting just exist if our rural communities were resilient enough without subsidies, and is that what we should be aiming for? I would argue yes, we should be aiming for it, but as I said, it's such a fragile picture all round that every little bit helps. So if you can get some payments in for crofting, that would be lovely. So we start to have a look at what public things do we have that we could pay for. There's not going to be unconditional payments. You're not going to be paid just for crofting. So what public goods can you provide? Did I write any more notes on this? No, absolutely didn't. There we go. So what I've done, and again this is the second of my questions, is some examples of public goods are carbon sequestration, carbon storage, that type of stuff, but also, let's say, not using as much carbon, but the general carbon levels. Biodiversity is a public good. Rural communities, or vibrant rural communities, are actually a public good. It's a service that is provided that benefits everybody. You can't take it away from somebody. So this is an example of a public good that it is worth the government putting money into something that it will support. Health is a public good. We spend a lot of money fixing health problems. We don't spend a lot of money stopping them from happening. But good food, a healthy lifestyle, access to recreational areas, the outside, working with the land even, these contribute to the public good of public health. And while food itself is not a public good, I would argue that resilient food systems are. So being able to access food reliably and quality food in rural areas is a public good. And this is something that crofting can contribute to. So I guess a few things I really wanted to get you thinking about in that is why do we want crofting? And when actually a lot of other things can achieve the same goals, and we talk a lot about community things here, crofting doesn't represent as much of the community as it used to. In our township, the crofters make up 20% of the community, whereas historically it would have been a lot more. We need to make sure that our focus on crofting is actually delivering the aims that we want, or should we just be focusing on community? So think about that. Why? Why crofting? Why do we think it's important? And how can we voice that? How can we explain that to policymakers, people outside, even people who move into our crofting communities and maybe don't understand the community and communal aspects that crofting has and the history that it has and why it's so important? And the other thing is, what do we deserve to be paid for? You know, I was talking last night about, yes, we should be having money in to support our rural communities, but why should it be the crofters getting that money? And that's where we need to actually deliver to get that money. So it's not honestly the big, like, happy, cheery, positive vision that I was hoping to be delivering in my talk. But I think that's the point we're at. There's a lot of conflict, there's a lot of change, it is coming. And there's a lot of people with different views, and a lot of them aren't represented in this room. And we need to see the views of as many different people as possible. Try and bring everyone along. We need a just transition for everybody, not just the people who are progressive or not just the people who agree with us. And we need to fit into the bigger systems, and that is where crofting is powerful, because it is just a framework. It's not just a framework. Culturally, it is a thing. But the framework of it then supports a lot of other stuff. But we need to be aware of that, and we need to highlight that to people. So that's me done with my 22 minutes. Brilliant.